That's great. Thanks, Eric. So hello, everyone. My name is Alessio Ciullo, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar organized by the Risk Modeling and Insurance Working Group. Today, we have the pleasure to have Stéphane Hallegatte as a speaker, and Stéphane will talk about how to assess and finance the full cost of disasters, including the role of infrastructure system and supply chain. So before giving the word to Stéphane, I'd like to introduce you who we are as a working group, what's our goal, what we are doing, and if you're interested, how to get in touch. So the working group is part of a broader, let's say, a broader network, which is called the Knowledge Action Network on Emergent Risk and Extreme Events. There are several working groups, and we specifically look at risk modeling and insurance. The main goal of the group is to build a community of researchers, practitioners, and stakeholders within the field of NatCat modeling and insurance in order to collaborate and share ideas, disseminate cutting-edge research in the field, and carry out research to address knowledge gaps in the field. So the group was established relatively recently. We so far identified 4 main topics which we focus on. So the first one is how to improve natural catastrophe models. Second is how to design new and innovative insurance products. Third pillar is modeling spillover mechanisms from insurance to the public sector. And the fourth is how to model systemic risk. As for the first theme, so improving natural catastrophe models, we identified few gaps. I go through them very quickly. So how to establish a coherent and sounded framework for the treatment model uncertainties via, for instance, a global sensitivity analysis. How to provide a comprehensive modeling of indirect impacts, namely but not only business interruptions. How to model feedback mechanisms between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and how to look at multi-hazards. And last but not least, how to exploit the full power of data-driven science and machine learning in the field of natural catastrophe models. As for designing new and innovative insurance products, this is just an example of what we thought could be an innovation, which we already see a little bit in the industry, but it's not yet established, which is basically how to build insurance products that allow protecting and restoring ecosystems and their services. In particular, as it's recognized that ecosystems basically act as a in terms of a positive action in terms of risk reduction. And third, modeling spillover mechanisms from insurance to the public sector. This is motivated by what happened in the late 90s in Europe, where we had 2 cyclones, Lothar and Martin. And when they hit, we saw that some primary insurers did not have the capacity to pay out settlement and damages. And when this happens, basically the burden falls on to the public. So the goal is, can we better study these scenarios also in light of climate change? And fourth is the modeling of systemic risk. So emerging and systemic risks, the way we define them, there are risks that arise from the interconnection of phenomena in a complex system. There are risks which are poorly understood, and there are risks which do not have a clear track record. And when faced with such risks, commonly used statistical techniques may fall short, and thus we might need new methods to risk quantification. In terms of activities, as I said, we are a recent, the group was recently established. So we are so far been busy in organizing this series of webinars. We do have monthly meetings where we try to exchange ideas and foster collaboration between the group members, which to date are mostly scientists and academics. We are starting to organize a workshop, which probably will take place early next year, and organize sessions in scientific conferences. So if you want to know more or to get in touch, you can go to the RISC-ON. I hope you can see my cursor, but you can go to the RISC-ON website, and then working groups, and you see the full list of working groups. Of course, you can get in touch with any of them. Our group is the modeling and insurance. You can click on the document. There is a nice description and email addresses. Or you can also subscribe to the mailing list. Again, on the RISC-ON website, there's a subscription section. You can subscribe to the RISC-ON general mailing list, but also to single mailing list of the different working packages. So with this, that's all from my side. And I'd like to move now. I'll stop sharing, so I give the time to Stéphane to share his screen. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who is Stéphane Hallegatte. Stéphane is the lead economist of the World Bank Climate Change Group. He was the lead author of the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC. He is the author of dozens of articles published in international journals, as well as several books and World Bank reports. In 2018, he received the Burtoni Award for his work on the link between climate change, adaptation, and poverty reduction. And also, he holds an engineering degree and a PhD in economics. Stéphane will talk roughly for 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. To pose your question, you could either raise your hand, and then you will be allowed to speak. That's, I'd say, the preferable way, because that way we get a bit of interaction. But if you don't want to, then just write your question in the chat, and then I will read it out loud. Just for the sake of information, the webinar is being recorded, and then it will be put online on the RISC-ON website. So with this, I'd like to give the floor, or shall I say the screen, to Stéphane.
Yes, hello everybody, and thanks for having me in this seminar. It's a great opportunity to discuss the topics on which we have been working and to get feedback. At the World Bank, climate change has been an important topic for years now, but I have to say we're in a phase of very rapid acceleration in mainstreaming climate risks and climate change policies into the different things that we're doing, from technical assistance to operations and lending. So this is a very good time to get feedback about what's really important and to get in touch with people able to help us either in our global work or when we work in a country or another. So this is very useful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Because this group is focused on disaster risk finance, I think it's useful for me to start by saying that we have a full group doing disaster risk finance, and the group has been growing really, really fast with a lot of support from a few countries like the UK and Germany. And this group has been working on tools and models, and also in many very specific operations in some countries. So in countries like the Philippines, for instance, this team at the World Bank has helped basically create an insurance system for the provinces in the country. So we have really this full chain, from relatively researchy things and papers, the whole way to operations and the creation of financial products. So many ways of interacting. Today I want to talk about infrastructure, and that's because when governments come to us for disaster risk finance, one of the big worry is the contingent liabilities created by infrastructure. So there is a big disaster, they need to spend on reconstruction, and they are looking for help to do that. But there is also this question of the full impact of disasters on GDP, tax revenues, the role of business interruptions. And this is, of course, something that is very much related to what happens to infrastructure. When there is no power and no water, there is very little economic activity going on. So our work is really trying to cover all of those bases, like the reconstruction costs, but also the broader impact on the economy. And this is what I will talk about today. Let me share this. What I will do is to start with the contents of a book we published last year, plus some more recent work on that. The book is on resilient infrastructure, and I'll try to, in my presentation, focus on the link with this insurance and finance component. Let me first start with when we started working on resilient infrastructure. A lot of people were asking about what we were talking about, and I think in the book we try to organize a little bit what we mean with infrastructure resilience. And we came up with 3 levels. One level is the level of the asset. So a resilient infrastructure asset is, for instance, a road that will be less costly to maintain and to repair over time. So if you're like the road agency in a country, this is the type of resilience you really care about, because you don't want to spend all of your budget in repairs. But there is also a definition of resilient infrastructure at the system level, with this idea that we don't care so much if one asset is damaged or cannot function, provided that the system can keep providing what it's supposed to provide. So at that level, the definition of resilient infrastructure is about reliability and the ability of the system to provide an output even when there is an extreme event or a disaster. But in the same way, we don't care if an asset is down, provided that the system works. We also don't care if the system cannot really provide like normal times, provided that all of the users can deal with that. So there is a third level, which is at the level of the users, and here there is a different definition. It's of the resilience of infrastructure. It's the ability to produce what users really need, taking into account their ability to deal with shocks. So here you have those 3 levels, and the idea of this work was to say that if you want all of your assets to be resilient, it will be super expensive. If you extend the question to the full system, you might find ways of doing that for less. It's cheaper if you don't want all of your assets to be indestructible, but if you think about the system level performance. And it will be even less expensive and easier to achieve if you bring users in and you don't try to have infrastructure systems that can deliver all the time, but you have your users ready to cope when there is a disruption. And the goal here was really to try to maximize the benefit cost ratio, in a sense, by having as many options on the table. And our other goal, of course, was to try to bring a different set of people around the table when you talk about infrastructure resilience. I don't know what your experience is with that, but mine is that a lot of the highest level decision makers think that this is a job for the engineers in line ministries, and this is not their job. By having a user-focused approach, we try to also bring the Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy in the loop, telling them that the resilience of infrastructure is not only about engineering, it's also about quality of life, performance of the economy, competitiveness, productivity, so that it becomes sort of a higher level question in governance. I'll cover a few of the things that we're doing in the report with this focus on insurance and financing, and starting with a diagnosis of the situation today. One first thing that we did, nothing very original here, was to start from a database of about 60 million infrastructure assets collected from different sources, and that we overlaid with hazard data for things from earthquakes and cyclones and floods to try to do a very typical asset risk assessment. And our work suggested that every year the world pays $30 billion in repairing infrastructure assets, 18 billion in low and middle income countries. And what you see in the map is what matters the most. Globally, floods is the big problem, but depending on where you look, it's more like about cyclones or about earthquakes. So there is this difference across countries. But the point here is, from a pure like explicit liability of governments, this is more or less what they need to pay every year to repair. And so if you're only focused on the financing question about reconstruction, this is the approach. You just do those overlays. And I have to say, this is global, so it's relatively simple. When we do it at the country level, it's sometimes surprisingly difficult because many countries don't have an inventory of their infrastructure assets. So they just don't know what they have. And for instance, you take Kinshasa, the city of Kinshasa. There is electricity in the city, but there is no database with the localization of the transformers and substations. The people working on them know where they are, but you don't have a database for that. So doing the very simple risk assessment is much more complicated than what one can expect, just because we don't have a list of public assets, making things very difficult. But here, our point in that work was to say that if you look only at reconstruction, you're missing the big picture, because the big picture is really the implication of infrastructure disruptions on the rest of the economy. And for government, it's as important because it might not affect spending and reconstruction, but it affects the performance of the economy and tax revenues. So there is also an impact on public budgets. We did this assessment of the economic losses due to infrastructure disruptions, reaching this assessment between $400 and $700 billion per year, so much higher than reconstruction costs. This is only low and middle income countries. And this is based on mostly the World Bank Enterprise Survey, where we have 140,000 firms in 140 countries reporting on infrastructure disruptions and how it affects their business. And also we did some empirical analytics connecting performance of firms with the disruptions. We highlighted a few big buckets here. For firms, a big part of the cost is reduced utilization rate. So you have this nice fancy little restaurants, but because there is no water and no power, you have to keep your restaurant closed. And so the utilization rate of your assets is reduced, and the global cost seems to be around 150 billion per year. There are the lost sales, which somewhat interact with utilization rate, but not fully. And of course, especially for power, but also for water, there is everything that firms spend to have their own generator and their own water tanks. And that's also a significant cost. And there are many other things that are important, but we couldn't assess, like some firms would not use the best technologies because they don't have reliable power. And this is much more difficult to assess, but also important. On households, uncertainties are much bigger. And also we looked at willingness to pay, but it's not really clear if it includes all of the health impacts of not having good water and good power, or also like the gender implications, because women tend to be the ones fetching water when the water pipe is not working. So the point here was really to try to move this discussion from just a very narrow view on reconstruction to something broader on the impact on the whole economy, and taking into account sort of business interruptions created by infrastructure, which might magnify the impact of disasters quite a lot. On the infrastructure disruptions, not all of them are due to natural disasters and environmental factors. And interestingly enough, there is very little data about that. So we did a few of our own surveys, like we did a survey of 800 firms in Tanzania, for instance, and we found about half of the transport and power disruptions were linked to floods. And the cost was close to 1% of GDP in Tanzania. But this is just because we did the study, and this is not available in all countries, which is obviously a good area for new research. And if you're interested in new research, I have to say that the job of collecting the data that exists on power and water disruptions, which very often exists, but it's very difficult to access, and sometimes in paper forms or in PDF format, and transform that into a database that you can use to do some empirical work and look at the impact. This for me is time consuming, but it would be a really, really important type of work to better inform governments, because in a lot of cases, nobody knows the actual reason why countries have so much disruptions of their infrastructure. So more information on that would be very useful. I want to go now to the solutions, and I will use my little framework, assets, services, and systems, and then users. And most of my talk will be in the last one on the infrastructure users. So on the assets, this is probably not the topic for today, but don't try to read these slides just for illustration purposes, but we have worked with engineering firms to identify a lot of technical options to build infrastructure better. And for all of those technical options, very hardcore engineering stuff, we try to assess how much more it would cost to do it all the time, and how much it would reduce damages when something bad happens. So we have this this menu of technical options, which were very much influenced by what is done in California, Japan, or the Netherlands, and could be applied in developing countries. So we have 70 of those. So of course I won't go through all of them, but that's really our starting point, is the engineering stuff. But then we move to the system level, and then it gets more complicated and also more interesting. So let me use this comparison of Belgium and Madagascar to illustrate that. At the World Bank, when we work on the new roads, we do an economic analysis of that road, but in most cases, we do it only for that road, and we don't have an analysis of the full network. But of course, if your road is interrupted by a flood or like an earthquake in Belgium, most likely what happens is that you just have to drive around. If it happens in Madagascar, most likely what happens is that an entire region of the country is being isolated. Really a big problem. One thing we did is, and that's what's shown on the right, we randomly cut roads in countries. So assume that you have like 5% or 10% of the roads being cut at one point in time in a country. We looked at what it would do to the functioning of the system in terms of isolating places. And the blue line is for Belgium. And in Belgium, you can destroy 20% of the roads, and you only lose maybe 2, 3, 5% of your system ability to transport people and goods. In Madagascar, if you remove 10% of the roads, you have lost 70% of your system. So what we're trying to do here is say that for a government assessing the value of building more resilience, the value per project will be much higher in Madagascar than in Belgium, because the network has no redundancy. And similarly, and I'll come back to that, if you're thinking about what you want to reconstruct, you can create priorities based on those type of analytics. The last level is when you bring users. I won't get into the details, but you really have to have a quick look at critical services and how they deal with infrastructure disruptions. Sorry, there is a little kid running upstairs that might make some background noise, but nobody in the world can do anything about that. So we really have to look at a few things like national security,
Stéphane, I think your line is a little bit bad.
Yes.
I think your line is a bit bad because you are falling out sometimes, and your picture is frozen. If you can try to turn off your camera and then turn it on again and see how it goes.
Okay. You cannot see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Ah, okay. And you can hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, good.
Yeah, Zoom is misbehaving, I have to say. I can't even stop my camera. So let me try to keep going, and you tell me if it's too bad.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying, I hope you got that you need specific treatments for critical services, your business that needs business continuity plans, and you can save a lot here. And also what's happening to your households. And for instance, we find that you can minimize quite a lot your costs if you can convince households to have 3 days of water and food in their home. Then it gives you like 3 days to restore services in case of a disaster. And this additional flexibility can make everything much cheaper and much better. So it's really worth trying to work on what households are doing. In the last, I think I have about 10 minutes left. I want to focus on some work we did in Tanzania on the transport network. So it's work done with Célian Collomb and Julie Rosenberg. I told you that we did this survey of firms in Tanzania, and what was really interesting is if you ask firms why they cannot deliver on time, in most cases, it's not that they had a problem themselves. In most cases, they did not get the supplies that they needed, or they faced power outages, or they faced transport disruptions. And you see, internal problems are only 8% of the cases. So very clearly, if you want to think about missed production in Tanzania, you cannot look at one firm in isolation. You have to look at the full system, and that's what we were trying to do. We did that by starting with a firm network. So using a lot of economic data, plus our survey, we created a specialized input-output table. So it basically tells you in each city in the country what is produced and what it buys to other regions and other sectors. In parallel, we have some work on the transport network with all of the roads, and it's in Tanzania. It's mostly roads, but you have also the use of boats for imports and exports, but it's mostly roads for domestic transport. And basically, what we did then was to combine those two sets of data. So you know that sector X in Dar es Salaam is buying something in Dodoma. Then we do a list cost analysis to basically guess what trip will the goods starting from Dodoma and going to Dar es Salaam will take. And we can have the map that you see on the right, which is the physical flows on the network, assuming that people are using the least cost path. So this is fairly new, combining economic input-output data with the transport network. But a lot of people are doing similar exercises now in various countries. When you have that, what's really nice is that you can change your transport network. So here, for instance, we cut 2 roads, assuming that there is a flood and those roads are cut. And you can look at how the transport flows should be reallocated and what is the cost of doing that. And because we connect with an economic model modeling the supply chains, we can look at how the problems with the transport will affect production in various sectors and various places. And here it's an example. If you cut those 2 roads for 4 weeks, at the beginning nothing much happens, and then you have more and more losses in production and consumption. And then when the roads are reopened, system doesn't come back to normal because it takes time for firms to recreate their inventories, to meet the demand that they could not meet before. So you have this full dynamics that we can look at. And if we're thinking about the costs, we have two types of costs. A pure transport cost. So one road is closed, your truck has to go all the way around, and it takes, 6 more hours, and it costs more money. So you have like a cost propagation in the system. And then you have the cases where you cannot access the goods and services that you need to produce. In that case, you have shortages and you have production dropping because it's more costly, so that you cannot produce. And we find like 3 main results. First, we look at the criticality of the network for different supply chain. And here on the left, you see the most important roads for food security in the country. And on the right, you see the most important roads for trade, international trade, especially like connecting the port of Dar es Salaam with landlocked countries like Rwanda, Burundi, Zambia. And those two maps are not the same. So very often we talk about the criticality of the transport network in abstract terms, but in fact, the criticality depends on what supply chain you're talking about and what problem you're talking about. So here, if you care about food security, you will be focusing, for instance, on the south of Dar es Salaam, which is really important. If you care mostly about international trade, then the border with Zambia should be a priority. So here, what are we trying to do? We're trying to go to the government and say, what are your main concerns? Food security, trade, and we can translate your main policy issue, your main concerns, into a set of roads or a set of bridges that you need to spend money on. And the goal is really, instead of telling a country, you need to make your infrastructure more resilient, which costs dozens of billions and it's completely out of reach, to be able to identify the most important choking points so that we can spend the little money that they can devote to this problem to the right places. The other thing that we find is that the cost depends very much on how long the disruption lasts, and it's very, very
Now you disappeared again, Stéphane.
get the budgets to. I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah,
better now?
Yeah, better now. We hear you now. If we can start like 1 minute ago.
Okay. So on this second result, that the cost of an event depends very much on how long it takes to come back to normal. We find that this relationship is very non-linear. So if roads are cut for 1 week, it's painful, but because people have stocks and inventories, they can keep production going. So you mostly delay the production. If your interruption lasts 4 weeks, then you start to have a lot of scarcity in the system, and firms have to stop producing. This point is really important for disaster risk finance. We have cases in countries where it takes years, and up to 2 years. In India, we have examples. It took 2 years to get the budget to repair a road. So if you have good financial instruments able to step in quickly and to finance the reconstruction, you can hope to shorten the disruptions, and maybe you can make your roads more robust. But if you can repair them really, really quickly, you have a lot of economic benefits for your system. And finally, the last result is that when we talk about infrastructure, we tend to focus on supply side measures, making your system stronger, and we assess a few of those policies and their benefits. But you can also do supply side measures. So if your firms have bigger inventories, you can reduce the cost of disasters as much as by making your roads more resilient. If they have more suppliers, so they are less likely to face scarcity, it's the same thing. The cost will be reduced quite a lot. So this calls for a more like economy-wide approach to infrastructure resilience than what we are often doing. Hoping that the connection is better now, I want just to conclude on the few recommendations we have. I won't go into the details of all of the recommendations we give because there are a lot of them, but a lot of them are about institutions and the way we're making decisions and the way we prioritize spending. But what we're trying to do is to assess how much it would cost to make all of the new infrastructure we're building, especially in developing countries, more resilient. And our finding is that if you want to make all assets more resilient, the cost would be crazy and it would be impossible. But if you can focus on the exposed and important assets, then by increasing the cost of infrastructure by only 3%, you can already get very, very high benefits. And what are those benefits? We estimate that for every dollar invested, it's a return by about $4. So in total, if all of the new assets we're building now were built with higher standards, the net present value over the full lifetime would be $4.2 trillion. So I mean, there is a big uncertainty on that number, of course, but the short story is there is a lot of money on the table for governments if they do this work better. And just the last thing is we really focused on how we would spend more money if we had more to spend on that issue. And so if you take the full cost of infrastructure, starting with regulations and planning and going all the way to decommissioning, we flagged where more money would be useful. And it's really in the planning side, data and models, training and education, the very early stage of project design, and the maintenance of infrastructure. This is really where the money will be most useful. And one example to conclude on that is very often we're doing infrastructure master plans. And sometimes those master plans are planning billions of investments in infrastructure. But a master plan costs about $1 to $2 million, which means that it's very difficult to spend $500,000 on a good risk assessment. So the result is, because we're short in finance in the planning stage, we're missing opportunities to build billions of dollars of infrastructure better. And that's really a lot of resources wasted because infrastructure costs a lot of money, but we don't have a lot of money to design them well. So I'll stop here, just putting the full list of the people who contributed to this work. It's a big effort across all of the World Bank to do this work, and it was supported by the Japanese government. I'll stop here. Very happy to discuss how that relates to the work you were planning to do and how that could be useful, and also very happy to learn about what you're planning to do and how we can take that and make it useful for some of the countries we're working on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stéphane. It was a great presentation. It was really great to see how models can actually be used to find hotspots, criticalities, and then to let's say support investments. So we have got quite some time for questions. I think we have about 20 minutes. As I said, feel free to either post your question in the chat or preferably to just raise your hand or whatever, thumbs up on Zoom, and then you'll be allowed to speak. I just wait a sec to see whether there is some reaction.
There's no one yet.
Okay. Well, then my question is a bit, let's say, I mean, I found it fascinating. Like you could use this model to assess criticalities based on also what you're looking for, right? You said there could be critical spots for different sectors that you're looking at. You had one road for international trade and one road for food security. My question would be, how did the government in this case reacted to these results? Like, how did they perceive this? Because this can really lead them to efficiently spend the usually little money that they are available. But we know also that sometimes in policy and politics, there are different priorities, right? Which are not always that rational. So my question would be, did they welcome this modeling exercise? Are they going to, I don't know, replicate it, to integrate it in their planning? Or
so it's a good question, and the response is very diverse, but also very often very indirect, right? So we have the best cases, and I think the example is a work we did in Mozambique, looking a little bit like what I showed on Tanzania, that led to the creation of an information portal in the road agency to decide about priorities to spend money on maintenance. So that's basically the roads that are the most important for the economy and that have less redundancy would be prioritized over other places. And so in that case, the tool was developed for a World Bank project, but was then embedded into the agency normal practices. And we're doing a lot of that, what we call asset management systems, to help countries have an inventory of their assets and manage maintenance and repairs better. I think we make an important point about the different priorities, because one of the issue with criticality analysis is that it will favor the richest regions and the richest activities at the expense of poor ones. So we're making the case very strongly that this is not something that will give you the answer in terms of where you want to spend your money. It's one piece of information that you need to take into account. And we have a lot of work in parallel on identifying the basic needs, so that you're not prioritizing big businesses at the expense of very poor people. So it's an important point. In the case of Tanzania, I mean, people were interested. I think I mean, they are aware of the work and so on, but we haven't seen, like in Mozambique, the same take up of the approach. We're reproducing this work now in Laos and Cambodia and in Latin America. So hopefully this will become common practice.
Great, good to hear. Thanks. And this model, I saw a publication, but is the model open access? And that's the sort of academic kind of question.
Yes, I think the model is even like on a GitHub somewhere. But I mean, feel free to reach out if you're interested in picking it up. If anything, we're very, very interested in people taking these type of tools and applying them in other places, and very happy to even help make the link using our country team if there is a need of like local data and so on. Basically, internally, we don't have the capacity to answer all of the needs, so we're really not defensive on that. Quite the opposite. We have even like helped some of academic partners to use models in some cases, thinking that it just creates more capacity for us to use when the need arises.
Excellent, thanks. I'm glad to hear that. So we have Stergios Mitoulis, apologies for my pronunciation, who raised his hand. Please, Stergios, I think you are able to switch on your mic. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, Alessio. Yeah, that was excellent pronunciation. Stéphane, thank you so much for the presentation. Just a very quick question. Having the overview, of how resilience is being delivered worldwide, what are the main enablers? What is new out there that can actually help us to deliver resilience across the board, across different, assets, transport assets, water assets, energy asset? What are the main enablers in your opinion?
So I sort of started there in the sense, like, I think one of the big issue is the silos we have in decision making. So you have in governments, you will have people in the water and energy and transport ministries knowing everything about the system and the risks. What they are really struggling with is to make their case to the people who decides about the funding and the financing. So one first thing is really to being able to help the line ministries in energy, transport, and the rest to assess the macroeconomic implications of what they are talking about, so that we can all talk the same language and make the case for this spending that is not just to please the road engineers, but it's because people who wants to go to the hospital needs to be able to do so, and the people needs to deliver goods and services need to be able to do that. So that's first part, is the kind of silo breaking and making the case to the right place. The second part is the finance, because when infrastructure are designed in places with a lot of resources, people are doing the life cycle analysis, looking at the risks and the maintenance cost and so on. But in many places with financial constraints, people are just trying to minimize the upfront costs, because that's the binding constraint. They don't have the money to just do the investment. And if you do that, well, you sacrifice a lot of the long-term cost savings just to reduce the initial costs. And no arguments about the economics will ever work if people only take into account the upfront costs into account when they design projects. So if you offer financing that kind of relax the constraint on the upfront costs, then you can bring technologies that are more efficient if you do a life cycle analysis. But of course, a lot of countries have these constraints. With COVID crisis, the debt of countries have exploded. So if anything, the constraint on spending is much higher now than it was a year or 18 months ago. So this constraint is a really tough one to crack. The banks like the World Bank are helping with that by providing additional financing, but the values that we have, I mean, we're doing maybe 60, 70 billion per year. If you compare that with the hundreds of billions invested in infrastructure every year, of course, this is not the only, we cannot be the only solution. So progress on the financing of upfront cost is really critical, and connecting with the insurance question could be an interesting point, because maybe having the insurance covering the repairs can help you internalize the upfront, the costs, the lifetime costs, make it easier to internalize it over the short term. So that's something that maybe would need more exploration.
Great, thanks, Stéphane. Are there any more questions? Maybe I mean, about the financing, maybe there is such a scheme in place already, which I'm not aware of, but would you see feasible to basically condition the aid, the financial aid for building infrastructure to a sort of resilience measure? Like you showed this graph, you were comparing Belgium and another country, I think it was Madagascar. You could show clearly that at the same percentage of interruption of roads, actually the number of trips that was interrupted was extremely different. Then it was the degree of redundancy of your network, right? And I guess that like the more your the more redundant your system is, the more you're resilient, the higher the resilience of your system. So my question is, would it be feasible to sort of, from this graph, to come up with a resilience index or redundancy index, and to condition finance on the increase of such an index or something like that? To say, okay, we invest in infrastructures that increase the degree of resilience.
So in a sense, when we talk about World Bank financing or most of the multilateral development agencies, this is already part of the dialogue, in the sense that all of our projects are going through a risk screening, and now we are putting in place something that we call the resilience rating system, and we published a report on the resilience rating system a few weeks ago, which is basically putting like a letter between C and A+ on your project, depending on how well you have taken into account resilience issues. And we will use that rating to track our own portfolio and to make commitments in terms of making sure our own activities are building resilience into countries. But we also hope that this resilience rating system can be used by private project developers. So just as a way of telling investors and decision makers that they have done a good job at taking into account risks and resilience into their design. So if we start to see infrastructure funds saying, we don't want to invest in any infrastructure project, we want to make sure we invest in resilient ones, and therefore we will use that resilience rating system and invest only in projects rated, I don't know, at least B or at least A. Then you start to create this synergy with project developers doing more on resilience because it makes it easier to access financing, and investors selecting the best projects in terms of resilience, and we can move the needle. And so the projects from the development banks, we are doing it already, and it's a lot of work. It's not easy, but we're working on that. But the big difference in the world will be if and when we manage to get domestic finance, so the investments of governments and private investments, to do the same type of risk screening and risk assessment. That's where the big value lies. So our project have a lot of conditionality in terms of doing this analytics. The question is, how do we make that become normal practice in all of the projects? Much more difficult, but that's the end goal. So we're kind of like using our own projects as pilots to try to show what works and what's useful, and using that learning we do on our own projects to try to convince other investors to do the same. And of course, it connects with the question of the green bonds and question of transparency in financial markets that the task force for financial climate disclosure is working on. So there are a lot of initiatives on that, and we're trying to contribute our little part using our portfolio to help inform those decisions.
Great, cool, thanks, Stéphane. So we have a question in the chat from Sophie Ebden. Do you do projections forward in time, for example, estimating the system resilience for different climate warming scenarios with associated sea level rise, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so we have done some of that, especially for floods, where we have really a lot of work on creating flood maps for today's climate and future climates. And it's as you know, it's a tricky thing, because in rich countries you have the data, especially the digital terrain models. You have the high resolution data. We don't have that in most of the countries we're working on. So it means that the quality of the flood maps we're having is much lower, and so it means that we cannot really use them in the same way. In Europe, very often you're able to make very precise zoning policies, for instance. This is not something we can do the same way in developing countries if you don't trust your models too much. But we're doing that. Actually, our resilience rating system is looking a lot at how people are going beyond historical data to do the risk and resilience assessment. And if you're using only historical data, you don't get a very high rating. And a lot of the guidance we provide to our teams relates to how to use future projections. And on that, at least my main concern is overconfidence. It's very easy to say, oh, I've used the state-of-the-art climate models coupled with this state-of-the-art hydrological model, and this is my new flood map. Except we don't really know, and we see already cases where, especially private providers of climate information, tell countries that this is the future, and then people are making decisions based on that. And if you had used another model, you would have made very different decisions. And one of the big worry is a little bit like we see big disasters when people trust their dikes too much. We fear that people who trust too much our ability to predict future hazards would make big mistakes. So we're working a lot on how to manage the uncertainty on future projections and how to make decisions which are robust to that uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think this connects with all the DMDU frameworks, right? Decision frameworks.
Yeah, so our resilience rating system calls a lot for stress tests, where you don't really pretend that this is what's going to happen, but you make like a very pessimistic assumption on how floods will evolve. You look at your project and its performance. If you're very pessimistic and your project works, then you're good to go. We don't need to do super sophisticated work. If you have like a $1 billion project that breaks when you have a pessimistic scenario, then maybe you need to spend a little bit more money into digging deeper. So we're trying to have this sequenced approach where we start with simple tools, but being pessimistic, so that when there is no problem, we can just exit. And for the project that need it, we're trying to find resources so that all of the projects can do more than a simple stress test, but really do a good risk assessment. And as you said, we're working a lot on those like robust decision making approaches, basically trying to identify vulnerabilities of your systems and trying to find good and cheap solutions to reduce those vulnerabilities without pretending that we can predict future costs. So I'm always fighting to just not answer the question everybody has, which is what is the future cost of climate change? Just because I can give you a number, but it's not very useful. It's much more useful to identify priorities and ways to reduce those priorities, rather than trying to get the one number that summarizes everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think one more maybe challenge that you have in the case studies you showed is that there is a strong dynamic, right? Time dynamic in these systems which is not just isn't resolved by just applying future scenarios. But maybe that's something you're addressing with the agent-based model. You have changes in your system which aren't easy to predict, let's say.
Yeah, and that's why. So on Tanzania, for instance, the model has a 1-day time step. So we're really like looking at supply chain and how they work with very short time scales. But that's also why we tend to do our analysis first looking at sort of changes in average conditions. It's a sort of like slow drift linked to climate change. But then we treat extreme events as a separate block, because a lot of the models that we use for the long-term global scenarios might kind of miss what happens to extreme events. So what we recommend people to do is to look at the sort of average conditions, but also to look at, for instance, the 100 or even the 1,000 year return period shock and how the probability of that might change. So we're creating right now out of climate scenarios some new data sets on how the return period are expected to change in the models, so that people can have a separate block to look at the short-term dynamics. And one thing that's probably won't have time to discuss too much today is there is this big question on the response of economic systems and people in the sense like if you have like an increase in risk, so if you think about like a coastal zone with an increase in risk, the real economic shock will happen when people start to internalize that risk, and the way they internalize can be very disconnected from the physical trend. It's just that at one point there will be a consensus that, oh, the risk will become too big and you can have a big drop in asset values and a big drop in investments and a big boost in out migrations. And the time this happens, and whether it's a big shock or a slow trend, it's behavioral science, basically. So the physics doesn't really help you very much here. And because we're not so good at predicting people, it's another reason to have a very modest approach, and to use scenarios and to use stress testing, and not pretend that we can predict what's going to happen, because I think to a large extent it's unpredictable. So we have to find other way of being useful than pretending that we can predict that.
Great, thanks, Stéphane. And I think with this, time is up. I'd like to thank Stéphane a lot for your time and for accepting to giving this talk. I'd like to thank everybody who joined the webinar. Yeah, I wish you all either a good day or a good evening, depending on wherever you are in the world. And thanks a lot.